So now we will discuss some practical tips and suggestions on how to deal with suspected trafficking and in-trafficking cases during interviews. First of all, if you are suspecting that the person before you might be a survivor of trafficking or e-trafficking, it is essential that you take account of the individual circumstances and expressed needs and wishes, if there are any, of course. So before you proceed, it is critical to plan and prepare the interview. You can review what you know about the person, I mean nationality, language, age, cultural background, accommodation status, fleeing and journey circumstances. There might be some information that is crucial, recovery circumstances, and then find out as much as you can about the case before you start. So based on the available information, we can conduct a risk assessment. Depending on the circumstances, we might need to ask direct questions at a very early stage to assess risk for the person. So we have to be prepared. It is good that we prepare a written interview plan, but it's very important for us to make it flexible, because once the interview starts, you might be told things that change the plan completely. So identifying any available safe accommodation options is also very helpful. It is important and crucial to choose an appropriate cultural mediator, an appropriate location as well. I mean, a location that is secure, is clean, is free from interruptions and distractions. Establishing rapport also is very important. Engage with the survivor and explain the process. Some things and tips for establishing rapport, apart from our behavior and our language skills, is having also a friendly atmosphere in the room. We can always propose water to the person. We might have some tissues in case there is a challenging time that the person cries. We have to explain to the interviewee that we wish to record the interview, I mean keeping notes, and ask them if this is acceptable. Explaining the process to be followed is very helpful. Explaining the survivor rights throughout the process, for example, not to answer a question, to ask for the repetition of a question, to take a break, etc. Sometimes it is also important to explain our rationale of the types of questions to be asked, in order for the person to feel safe in entering this conversation. Explaining how information obtained might only be used upon receiving the person's informed consent is also very crucial. And also something that sometimes we underestimate is evaluating the process. So after closing the interview, try to assess what has happened, identify any further actions that you need to take, including additional interviews, and plan on how you will proceed with this case. So in this slide, we see some do's and don'ts during the interviews. We don't focus on the vulnerability. We have to focus on the person. We don't display signs of unease, of anxiety, of embarrassment. We try to be calm and helpful to the persons. We don't force control on the process. We have to return control. We don't ask lead questions. We try to ask open-ended or specific questions that might be helpful. We try to avoid talking fast or interruptions, interrupting the person while answering. So we try to talk slowly, clearly, and be patient in the process. It's important to highlight that we don't investigate. We try to be open, active, and empathetic to the survivors. We don't interpret or patronize them. We are always trying to be neutral, respectful, and aware of our own filters. Also, we don't have to challenge any statements. If there are like doubts or if we are in asylum procedure and there is a credibility issue, we ask kindly of clarification on our doubts. We never insist. We have to accept I don't know for an answer. If an information is crucial, we might return later on to the interview on this specific element. We never promise or predict things. We have to be clear on the options with specific information and give freedom of choice to the survivors. Also, we don't have to be self-critical on our performance or on our outcome. We have to be flexible. It is very helpful to be inventive on these processes and to be able to plan on further actions as needed. We're discussing about interviews and sessions with trafficking and e-trafficking survivors. We will now go forward on some tips and suggestions on working with interpreters and cultural mediators. So in any type of communication, using a mediator might be challenging to the communication itself, let alone in the context of communication across languages and cultural differences. Interpreters and mediators are critical partners in any relevant response, but yet their own perceptions and biases might affect the course of interviews with e-trafficking survivors, while also their profiles might encourage or discourage disclosure. For example, if the survivor or the interpreter if the survivor and the interpreter have the same cultural background, they come from the same country of origin, the same hometown, the same community, the survivor might be afraid that they know the same people or that their story will not be kept confidential, or even that the interpreters and mediators might be judgmental towards them, or also that they might the fact that they might belong in fighting ethnical or social groups can also affect the process. So as mentioned, during our preparation of the interview, it is essential to choose the appropriate interpreters and mediators. Common language is not the only valid criterion for that matter. We have to take into account that choosing a culturally appropriate interpreter or mediator has to be also in terms of gender, in terms of age, of class, of social cultural experience and sensitivity. For example, a sex trafficking survivor might be more comfortable with a human interpreter, as you can imagine. Regional conflict might mean a survivor is less likely to trust an interpreter from a particular ethnic background. We also have to take that into account. Sometimes using online translation and non-verbal communication to check the survivor if they are happy with our choice of interpreter, etc., might be also a way forward. We have to be aware of all spoken languages of the survivors before selecting an interpreter or mediator. We should not assume what language the survivors speak based on the country of origin, because there are, as you know, several countries that use multiple languages, or the survivor might be a minority and don't speak the official language of the country of origin. So we have to take into account all these considerations. We have to meet confidentiality standards as well. Check for potential prior relationship with the survivor. We have to check the interpreter and mediator's expertise, or checks with the survivor as well, to identify any prior relationship with the interpreter or the mediator. For example, religious or community networks might be a common ground for prior relationship. This is something that we have to assess. It goes without saying that we should not use family members, as that might discourage the survivor from sharing intimate information, or there might be also some safety repercussions for them after the interview. It is important to build a mutual learning relationship with our interpreters and mediators. We have to make sure that they understand the significance of translating every little detail shared by the survivor, even the intimate ones. Interpreters and mediators are, as we said before, invaluable resources to help us understand the cultural, social, and political backgrounds of the survivor. So this is also something that we have to work on. We have to speak directly to the survivor, not the interpreter. We have to be an active listener and display our reactions directly to the survivor and not to the interpreter or the mediator. Last but not least, debriefing is very important. Debrief with interpreters, with cultural mediators, as they may have noticed cultural related issues that we might have missed, or that we might not aware. So in this process, it is also important to adopt a trauma-informed approach. So in our work with trafficking, any trafficking survivors, we have to consider the traumatic past of them. I mean, it is critical to keep in mind that these individuals may have experienced trauma, both physical or emotional, as a result of a series of concurring events, while the consequent effects of their physical, their mental or emotional well-being are lasting and persistent. So trauma significantly affects how the survivors perceive themselves. Sometimes they are placing themselves in a helpless or hopeless position where there is no one to trust. So These individuals inevitably tend to hold on to their victim status and their related beliefs also before the service providers, as they often tend to be mistrustful or frightened or even shameful on these collaborations. So while assuming a more reluctant and even defensive stand towards the service provider, the survivors often tend to be also jumpy, angry, and only willing to provide short or one-word answers. This is something that we have to take into account and create a physical space of trust for them to continue their disclosure. At this point, it is critical also to mention that for the service providers, a common danger is what we call the mirroring effect. So as professionals, we should try to prevent or avoid this effect. The mirroring effect is happening when professionals unconsciously imitate the defensive attitude of the survivor. So sometimes they feel that there is no point in undertaking the case. They feel despair because of there are no referral pathways to meet the needs of the survivors. So this is something that we also have to be alert on. Um, Assuming a respectful, non-biased and non-judgmental stand towards the survivor is the only way to move forward and be as effective as possible in any type of planned intervention. So, among the top priorities of the professionals engaged in the survivor support is to introduce them to their rights and options and to empower them through counseling and through psychological or psychosocial support. Therefore, the service providers ought to realize the prevalence of trauma and recognize its effects, I mean the signs, the symptoms. Of course, we have to keep in mind that not all the survivors are traumatized, and also people that experience similar or the same facts and painful experiences don't react with the same way because they have their own mechanisms, their own resilience. But realizing the prevalence of trauma also is helpful, always is helpful for us to be alert for specific signs and symptoms. Uh, Creating conditions of respect and trust is also very helpful, as this will help them develop the coping mechanisms and build on their resilience. Also encouraging the survivors to participate as much as possible in all relevant processes is very important, as by this way we make them feel that they are regaining control over their lives, an aspect that they might have lost while being exploited or in exploitative environments.